We're going to be making a Grignard today, and so this is this glassware that we'll need. We'll need a round bottom flask, 100 milliliters, collation adapter, we'll need a condenser, and we need an addition funnel, which I recognize that this is not technically an addition funnel because that would have a return tube here, but it will be functioning as our addition funnel. Now, the first thing that we need to do when we're doing a Grignard is dry the glassware. And you may think that this glassware looks dry, and it does look dry, but it's not actually dry. So we're going to use our Bunsen burner here and drive off all of the moisture inside, because the surface of glass has a lot of hydroxides on it, and that will cause us to not form a Grignard. So I'll just show you how to flame dry this. Now we want the glassware to all pretty much be set up just like this. We'll drive all the water out through the top, and then we'll be ready to start our Grignard once we let this cool off a little. Now, while it's cooling off, I have a drying tube that I'm going to put on top of the condenser right up here, just like this. But while I'm flame drying this, I want to not have this on here because there's the rubber there. Now, another important thing is I've removed the valve, this is plastic, from the separatory funnel. And if we don't, then it could melt. So just remove that first, and then we'll put it back on after we let this cool down just a little bit. All right, so let's get going. We get a Bunsen burner here, and we're just going to gently heat this, and you'll notice the glassware is going to have a little cloudiness to it, and that's water being driven off. So what looked dry is not actually dry, and so we're just going to work that water up and out of our setup here. And we'll just move the Bunsen burner around to do that. So just make sure. And we want to heat this not too vigorously because the glassware can have an issue there. And we're going to be careful around our clamps, right? We'd rather not burn those. And so just work it over the whole, over all the glass, and try to work that, and so all that moisture comes out. Now, when you're doing this, it's very important that your condenser has 0 water in it, even in the outside where our reagents aren't going. Because if you try to heat a condenser like this where there's water inside, you'll crack the condenser, and then there's really no way to repair that. So that's kind of important. Now, I always like to do this just a second pass on this too. So I'm going to come back down and heat up the bottom again and just dry it out. Any tiniest amount of moisture inside of this apparatus will stop the Grignard from being made. Okay, so once I have that, I'm just going to let this cool a little bit, and then I will reassemble the valve in the separatory funnel, and then we'll continue from there. So we have weighed out 1.5 grams of magnesium, and one of those was a strip, and then most of it was these little turnings, and we've crushed the magnesium turnings here to expose the magnesium and get past the oxide layer. And I've sanded this strip to get past the oxide layer. And now we're going to take that, we're going to add it to our dried flask here, and then reassemble everything. And we want to do this reasonably quickly so that we're not exposing it too much to the air that could get a little bit of water on that. but we'll probably be fine. So we get that in there, and then we will reassemble our apparatus. And then what we'll do is we will add our dry diethyl ether in, and we're going to add our bromo benzene in as well. All right, now we've got our dry diethyl ether, and I will probably have to help most of you with this because it has the Sure seal on it, and this is to maintain the lack of water inside. So we have got a syringe that we'll draw it out with. And the needles are long just so that we can reach the bottom of the container. So the first thing we need to do is add 5 milliliters of the diethyl ether into this flask with the magnesium turnings. And conveniently, our syringes have some markings on there, and it doesn't have to be exact, so I'm just gonna get some out. And to get it down in there, I'll just add it to my separatory funnel, and then I'll just let it go down in the flask. I'll just let all of it go down. Yeah. Then I'll close the valve here again. So now I've got some diethyl ether down in there. Now I need 20 milliliters of diethyl ether in my separatory funnel. So try to get that out without spraying it everywhere like I just did. Now, diethyl ether has a very low boiling point, and so it's easy for it to come out unnecessarily. So that's 10, which is the size of my syringe here, so I'll have to do this in 2 shots. So there we go. Got another 10. Next thing I need is my bromine reagent. We're using bromobenzene. And I've got it here, and I know it comes with a little thing on the side. I think I'll just use the needle with the syringe with this as well. And you'll notice down at the bottom here, we have these little beads. Those are molecular sieves, and they tend to pull water out of the solution so that it'll be dry. So again, one of the main things that we're doing here is to make sure it's dry. So I've got a different syringe, so I'm not contaminating my other sample. And we want 8 milliliters of this. So just based on the size of this syringe, I'll need to do this a couple of times as well. So there's 4. And I'll try to mix that around a little bit when I'm putting it in. And then here's another 4. So that's my 8. So I do want to mix this around in here, so I think I'll just take this up and just do a little shake and put it back. All right, so next thing to do is we want about 1/3 of this to go down into our magnesium, so then it can start reacting. So in order to get it to drain, we will have to vent the stopper here and then just let some in. Now it's hard to estimate 1/3 because it's a conical funnel. So we'll just have to kind of guess on that. But we don't want to add all of this in because we can get some side reactions if we get too much of the bromide in there at the same time. Now, at this point, you kind of have to wait, but you can warm this up. And one of the ways that you can warm this up is just by holding the flask. Oddly enough, just because this is a low boiling point solvent. But before we get too far, we're going to go ahead and hook this up to the water condenser and get that running. So I think it might be starting here, and you can just see like a little bit of bubbling there. And I've just literally been holding this flask in my hands because the boiling point for diethyl ether is only 34 degrees and people are 37. So, and it's kind of convenient in this way because this is an exothermic reaction, and once it starts going, it will generate its own heat, and that's when we really want that condenser running. So I've got the condenser running, and we'll try to see what we can do here. So I'll come back when this reaction is really going vigorously. If you're getting a little tired holding it with your hand, or you feel like you're just not warming it up enough, you can always try the heating well. I am just holding the heating well up, and I only have it set on 2, which is pretty low. I'm just going to use this to make sure I can get this going. The other thing that we might have to do is add a little bit of pre-made Grignard to the flask, and that can kind of catalyze or make it go a little quicker. So once this gets going though, it is exothermic and we will not need a heating well for it. So that's why I just kind of have this held up here. And if you keep the heating well at a low temperature setting, you should be able to hold the bottom of it. And you should keep it at a low setting because the ether boils at such a low temperature. And you'll know the reaction is going if the bubbling and everything continues after you've removed the heat. So this is looking pretty good, because I feel like it would have stopped bubbling if the reaction hadn't started yet. At this point, we'll want to let it bubble for a while And once it slows down from where it is, then we'll add more of our bromobenzene solution in here to maintain the forming of the Grignard. And after a while, we will have added all of the solution that we have in our addition funnel. At that point, we'll let it bubble again and just keep forming the Grignard. And you may notice that the amount of magnesium will decrease as this process goes forward, but it's unlikely that all of it will be used up because we used an excess amount of the magnesium. So I'm going to go ahead and start a time lapse on this at this point, but at various points during here, I'll be adding a little bit more of my bromobenzene solution from the addition funnel just to maintain the reaction rate. All right, so our Grignard has stopped bubbling and we've finished the addition. And you might have noticed that over the time lapse that we had quite a bit of bubbling without even heating. And again, that's because this is an exothermic reaction. Next, we're just going to show how to do the benzophenone, or make the triphenyl methanol. And that's just because I didn't grab dry ice for this part, but we're going to take about 9.3 grams of the benzophenone. It sounds like a lot, but benzophenone is a pretty big molecule, and so it weighs a fair bit. And I'm going to add about 15 milliliters of the diethyl ether to this. And I should mention, we flame dried this beaker and then we let it cool down so that we don't want to put the hot or the ether in the hot flask here. We're just adding this in, and then we will start adding in our Grignard in just a minute once this dissolves. All right, so we've got our benzophenone solution here, and we've got our Grignard, and we're going to slowly add the Grignard into the ketone solution here. And I thought it might be good to wear gloves just in case, because the Grignard is fairly reactive, and we want to just slowly add this. And if we get a little bit of the magnesium in here, that'll be okay, because during the workup step, we have to add acid, and the acid that we're using is hydrochloric acid. It will chew up any of the magnesium if we get a little bit in here. So I'm just going slowly, and I'm just watching to make sure it doesn't bubble over. And again, just because the Grignard is something that I don't want on my hands, I went ahead and put some gloves on, especially since some of it might come down the side of the flask here. So just adding that in slowly. After this, we'll heat it for a few minutes just to make sure that the reaction goes to completion, and then we will be doing acid workup step. noticed that the solution got a little cloudy, and that's likely just from the solubility of the triphenyl methanol. It's not really methanol yet because we haven't protonated that oxygen. So since it's a little bit more polar and we have a very non-polar solvent here, that's probably why we're seeing that crash out a little bit. And that's okay. We're going to want it out of the solution eventually anyway. Now, be careful with any residual stuff in this beaker, because if you add water to this to try to wash it out, we are going to have a reaction with the Grignard, the leftover Grignard. So we just need to be mindful of that. And it's probably okay to add some water to it, but I would do that in the fume hood. So now that we've added our Grignard, we're going to gently heat this for 5 minutes. And we need to be careful and watch this because, again, the ether has a really low boiling point. So just really babysit this. And if it starts getting too vigorous, just take it off of the heat. And we currently have this heating well set at 3 just to get it started. But I'm going to turn it down to 2 now that we've got it warmed up. So we've allowed this a few minutes to react with the Grignard, and now we're going to acidify this with the 6 molar hydrochloric acid. Now, we need to go very slowly with this because any residual Grignard is going to react quite a bit with the Grignard, or with the acid. So I'm just going to add this kind of slowly. Reaction happening there, a little bubbling. So I'm just going to let that happen for a little bit here. I'll come back after I've added enough acid here to make it actually acidic. Alright, so we have acidified this, and now we're going to put it on a Grignard funnel, filter this out, and try to clean it up a little bit. But sometimes this gets a little bit messy, or just doesn't look as pretty as some of the other compounds do. So since we already had a solid and most of the ether evaporated in the fume hood when we added the acid, and that really heated up the container and it boiled away a lot of the ether, we just decided to go ahead and use the Grignard funnel to separate the compounds. Next, we're going to transfer this into another beaker, add a little bit of this non-polar solvent Grignard to it, and this will dissolve any of the byproduct of biphenyl. That's one of the things that we were trying to avoid by adding the bromobenzene in slowly when we were forming the ether, or the Grignard reagent. So we've washed it with a pretty good amount of the Grignard, and we're letting this pull some air through just to make sure that we get all of the Grignard off of it. The purpose of that is to remove any of the biphenyl byproducts. And then we will measure the yields and any other spectroscopy or melting points that we need to, and we'll be finished.